Okay, welcome to the Read Aloud for Monday, May 4th, day 49. All right, let's see, where were we? Now it was Mary's turn. I put William on the carpet beside me and rewarded him with some extra crumbs and a currant. Then I started going through the same routine all over again with Mary. My blinding ambition, you see, my dream of dreams, was to become one day the owner of a white mouse circus. I would have a small stage with red curtains in front of it, and when the curtains were drawn apart, the audience would see my world-famous performing mice walking on tight ropes, swinging from trapezes, turning somersaults in the air, bouncing on trampolines, and all the rest of it. I would have white mice riding on white rats, and the rats would gallop furiously around the stage. I was beginning to picture myself traveling first class all over the globe with my famous white mouse circus and performing before all the crowded heads of Europe. I was about halfway through Mary's training when suddenly I heard voices outside the ballroom door. The sound grew louder. It swelled into a great babble of speech from many throats. I recognized the voice of the awful hotel manager, Mr. Stringer. Help, I thought. But thank heavens for the huge screen. I crouched behind it and peered through the crack between two of the folding sections. I could see the entire length and width of the ballroom without anyone seeing me. Well, ladies, I am sure you will be quite comfortable here, Mr. Stringer's voice was saying. Then, in through the double doors, he marched, black tailcoat and all, spreading his arms wide as he ushered in a great flock of ladies. If there is anything we can do for you, do not hesitate to let me know, he went on. Tea will be served for all of you on the Sunshine Terrace after you've concluded your meeting. With that, he bowed and scraped himself out of the room as a vast herd of ladies from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children came streaming in. They wore pretty clothes, and all of them had hats on their heads. The meeting. Now that the manager had gone, I was particularly alarmed. What better than to be imprisoned in a room full of these splendid ladies? If I ever got them to talking, I might even suggest that they come and do a bit of cruelty to children prevention at my school. Would certainly use them there. In they came, talking their heads off. They began milling round and choosing their seats, and there was a whole lot of stuff like, come and sit next to me, Millie dear, and oh, hello, Beatrice. I haven't seen you since the last meeting. What an adorable dress you have on. I decided to stay where I was and let them get on with their meeting while I got on with my mouse training. But I watched them for a while longer through the crack in the screen, waiting for them to settle down. How many were there? I guessed about 200. The back rows filled up first, and then all seemed to want to sit as far back from the platform as possible. There was a lady wearing a tiny green hat in the middle of the back row who kept scratching the nape of her neck. She couldn't leave it alone. It fascinated me the way her fingers kept scratching away at the hair on the back of her neck. He had known somebody was watching her. Had she known somebody was watching her from behind, I'm sure she would have been embarrassed. I wondered if she had dandruff. All of a sudden, I noticed that the lady next to her was doing the same thing, and the next one, and the next. The whole lot of them were doing it. They were all scratching away like mad at the hair on the back of their necks. Did they have fleas in their hats? More likely it was nits. A boy at school called Ashton had nits in his hair last term, and the matron had made him dip his whole head in turpentine. It killed the nits all right, but it nearly killed Ashton as well. Half the skin came away from his scalp. I began to be fascinated by these hair-scratching ladies. It is always funny when you catch someone doing something coarse and she thinks no one is looking, nose-picking, for example, or scratching her bottom. Her hair scratching is very nearly as unattractive, especially if it goes on and on. I decided it had to be knits. Then the most astonishing thing happened. I saw one lady pushing her fingers underneath the hair of her head, and the entire head of hair, lifted up all in one piece, and the hand slid underneath the hair and went on scratching. She was wearing a wig. She was also wearing gloves. I glanced swiftly around at the rest of the now seated audience. Every one of them was wearing gloves. My blood turned to ice. I began to shake all over. I glanced frantically behind me for a back door to escape through. There wasn't one. Should I leap out from behind the screen and make a dash for the double doors? Those double doors were already closed, and I could see a woman standing in front of them. She was bending forward and fixing some sort of metal chain around the two door handles. Keep still, I told myself. No one has seen you yet. There's no reason in the world why they should come and look behind the screen. But one false move, one cough, one sneeze, one nose blow, one little sound of any sort, and it won't be just one witch that gets you. It'll be 200. And at that point, I think I fainted. The whole thing was altogether too much for a small boy to cope with, but I don't believe I was out for more than a few seconds. And when I came to, I was lying on the carpet, and I was still, thank heavens, behind the screen. There was absolute silence all around me. Rather shakily, I got to my knees and peered once again through the crack in the screen. Frizzled like a fritter. All the women, or rather the witches, were now sitting motionless in their chairs and staring as though hypnotized at somebody who had suddenly appeared on the platform. That somebody was another woman. The first thing I noticed about this woman was her size. She was tiny, probably no more than 4.5 feet tall. She looked quite young, I guessed about 25 or 26, and she was very pretty. She had on a rather stylish, long black dress that reached down to the ground, and she wore black gloves that came up to her elbows. Unlike the others, she wasn't wearing a hat. She didn't look to me like a witch at all. But she couldn't possibly not be one. Otherwise, what on earth was she doing up there on the platform? And why, for heaven's sake, were all the other witches gazing at her with such a mixture of adoration, awe, and fear? Very slowly, the young lady on the platform raised her hands to her face. I saw her gloved fingers unhooking something behind her ears, and then she caught hold of her cheeks and lifted her face clean off. The whole of that pretty face came away in her hands. It was a mask. As she took off the mask, she turned sideways and placed it carefully upon a small table nearby. And when she turned around again and faced us, I very nearly screamed out. That face of hers was the most frightful and most frightening thing I have ever seen. Just looking at it gave me the shakes all over. I was so crumpled and wizened, so shrunken and shriveled, it looked as though I had been pickled in vinegar. It was a fearsome and ghastly sight. There was something terribly wrong with it, something foul and putrid and decayed. It seemed quite literally to be rotting away at the edges. And in the middle of the face, around the mouth and cheeks, I could see the skin all cankered and worm-eaten as though maggots were working away in there. There are times when something is so frightful, you become mesmerized by it and you can't look away. I was like that now. I was transfixed. I was numbed. I was magnetized by the sheer horror of this woman's features. But there was more to it than that. There was a look of serpents in those eyes of hers as they flashed around the audience. I knew immediately, of course, that this was none other than the Grand High Witch herself. I knew also why she'd worn a mask. She could never have moved around in public, let alone book into a hotel with her real face. Everyone who saw her would have run away screaming. "The doors!" shouted the Grand High Witch in a voice that filled the room and bounced around the walls. "Are they chained and bolted?" "The doors are chained and bolted, your grandness," answered a voice in the audience. A brilliant snake's eyes that were set so deep in that dreadful, rotting, worm-eaten face glared unblinkingly at the witches who sat facing her. "You may remove your gloves," she shouted. Her voice, I noticed, had the same hard, metallic quality as the voice of the witch I had met under the conker tree, only it was far louder and much harsher. It rasped, it grated, it snarled, it scraped, it shrieked, and it growled. Everyone in the room was peeling off her gloves. I was watching the hands of those in the back row. I wanted very much to see what their fingers looked like and whether my grandmother had been right. Ah, yes, I could see several of them. Now I could see the brown claws curving over the tips of the fingers. There were about 2 inches long, those claws, and sharp at the ends. "You may remove your shoes," barked the Grand High Witch. I heard a sigh of relief going up from all of the witches in the room as they kicked off their narrow, high-heeled shoes. And then I glimpsed under the chairs of several pairs of stockinged feet, square and completely toeless. Revolting they were, as though the toes had been sliced away from their feet with a carving knife. "You may remove your wigs," snarled the Grand High Witch. She had a peculiar way of speaking. There was some sort of foreign accent there, something harsh and guttural, and she seemed to have trouble pronouncing the letter W. As well as that, she did something funny with the letter R. She would roll it around and round in her mouth like a piece of pork crackling before spitting it out. "Remove your wigs and get some fresh air into your spotty scalp," she shouted, and another sigh of relief arose from the audience as the hands went up to the heads and all the wigs, with the hats still on them, were lifted off. There now appeared in front of me, row upon row of bald female heads, a sea of naked scalps, every one of them red and itchy looking from being rubbed by the linings of the wigs. I simply cannot tell you how awful they were, and somehow the whole sight was made more grotesque because underneath those frightful, scabby, bald heads, the bodies were dressed in fashionable and rather pretty clothes. It was monstrous. It was unnatural. Oh heavens, I thought. Oh help. Oh Lord, have mercy on me. These foul, bald-headed females are child killers, every one of them. And here I am, imprisoned in the same room, and I can't escape. At that point, a new and doubly horrifying thought struck me. My grandmother had said that with their special nose holes, they could smell out a child on a pitch-black night from right across the other side of the road. Up to now, my grandmother had been right every time. It seemed as certainly, therefore, that one of the witches in the back row was going to sniff me out at any moment, and then yell of "dog droppings" would come up all over the room, and I would be cornered like a rat. I knelt on the carpet behind the screen, hardly daring to breathe, and then suddenly I remembered another very important thing my grandmother had told me. "The dirtier you are," she had said, "the harder it is for a witch to smell you out." How long since I had a bath? Not for ages. I had my own room in the hotel, and my grandmother never bothered with silly things like that. Come to think of it, I don't believe I've had a bath since we arrived. When had I last washed my hands or face? Certainly not this morning, not yesterday, or either. I glanced down at my hands. They were covered with smudge and mud, and goodness knows what else besides. We better stop there. Here's a picture, though. All right, see you guys tomorrow.